The wall was a fact of life, and always had been for people her age. It had been erected 4 years before her birth, and so she had never known a single united Germany. Those living west of the wall enjoyed a relatively stable democracy with regular elections, personal freedoms, and a strong economy, while those to the east, like her, lived under an autocratic socialist dictatorship and the censorship, surveillance, and restricted liberties that came with it. That's just the way it was. Or at least the way it had been up until the previous fall, when after 28 years, the wall had been torn down at last. This year, the Berlin Marathon course had been rerouted to incorporate both sides of the previously divided city. And now she was on that course, not as an East German, but as a German. It was the moment that she passed through the Grand Brandenburg Gate, which had served as the symbol of Berlin's division for her entire life, that the significance of this fully hit her. Moments later, she broke the tape in a new course record, and even though the two Germanys would not be officially reunified for another 3 days, her victory marks the beginning of a new era for her homeland. Today is Sunday, September 7th, 2025, and on this day in 1965, three-time Berlin Marathon champion Uta Pippig was born in Leipzig, East Germany. In this episode, we will learn more about her early life at the epicenter of the Cold War and how that first Berlin win in 1990 began an incredible career with 7 World Marathon major wins in 7 years. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and you are listening to Today in Running History. There are so many ways to think about just how long 28 years is. It represents 85% of my own life, but is just a tiny blip when considered within the timeline of human history. For many of the roughly 1.3 million people living in East Berlin in 1988, it was an entire lifetime. I think it's impossible for any of us, regardless of age, to comprehend what it must have been like to grow up in a city that was divided by a 13-foot wall, protected at all times by guards whose orders were to shoot to kill anyone trying to cross to the other side. My first thought is how hard it would be to not dwell on the unfairness of it all. The knowledge that had I been born just a bit to the left or to the right, my life would have been totally different. It was Uta Pippig's destiny to be born on the east side of the wall in Leipzig, a city of just under 600,000 people in 1965. It would play a pivotal role in the revolution leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall, but of course that was many years down the road. Uta moved out of the city with her parents, both doctors, when she was 4. While they were loving and supportive, her parents saw Uta's future in medicine, not running, despite the promise she showed beginning around age 13. But her insatiable love for the sport, coupled with her natural talent, caught the eye of one of the most prestigious clubs for young athletes in East Germany, and she was recruited. For several years, Uta successfully managed to balance academics and running, winning the Leipzig Marathon in 1986 and 87, and finishing 14th in the marathon at the 1987 World Championships in Rome. But it wasn't until the downfall of communism that she was able to become a significant factor in the field of elite running. What some people don't realize about the collapse of the Iron Curtain is that the destruction of the Berlin Wall marks the beginning of that process rather than the end. When the wall came down on November 9, 1989, East Berliners were free to travel to West Berlin and all of Germany for the first time since the wall was erected in August 1961. Or so they thought. Turns out it was a bureaucratic error regarding new travel guidelines that led to the premature opening of the borders and, later that night, the exuberant crowd beginning the destruction of the wall. That momentum was just too hard for the Stasi, or East German police force, to undo, but many restrictions remained in place until the following summer, namely the inability to move freely outside of Germany. For an elite athlete such as Uta, this meant traveling to the West to compete would make her a military deserter. She and her longtime coach, Dieter Hogan, had long contemplated defecting, but had rejected the idea because of the risks involved. That changed in January 1990 when the pair drove into West Berlin without incident, but unsure what restrictions they would be forced to navigate in the coming months. Fortunately, all restrictions were lifted 3 months later, just in time for Uta to compete in the race that she had dreamed about for years, the Boston Marathon. She placed second in a time of 2:27:12, 2 minutes behind Rosa Mota of Portugal. With that race, Mota became the first woman in the official era to win Boston 3 times. 5.5 months later, Uta was in Berlin having the experience we opened this episode with. Along with 26,000 other runners, Uta traversed the streets of Berlin, some of which she had been barred from for her first 25 years of life. She described the experience of running through the iconic Brandenburg Gate as a feeling of boundless joy. When she crossed the finish line as the women's winner, she was overwhelmed with the idea that she was actually free to run this race, or any race in the world. She would return to win Berlin 2 more times, in 1992 and 1995. She also returned to Boston, where she stood atop the podium in 94, 95, and 96, becoming the first woman to win that race 3 consecutive times and setting a course record that would stand for 8 years. She ran her last Boston Marathon in 1997, where she finished 4th. In 1993, she won the New York City Marathon, and in 92 represented Germany at the Barcelona Olympics, finishing 7th in the 10K. In Atlanta, 4 years later, she was forced to drop out of the marathon competition due to a leg injury. She retired from competition in 2002. Uta Pippig became a U.S. citizen the day before Independence Day in 2004 and was sworn in a ceremony in, where else but Boston. She ran her first race as an American the next day, winning the 5-mile Minuteman Classic in her then home of Concord, Massachusetts. Today, she is the face of Take the Magic Step, the foundation she co-founded in 2008, a yoga and meditation teacher, and a motivational speaker. And that's the show for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share. Send this episode to someone who loves history or podcasts or both, and then join me tomorrow as we head all the way back to the 19th century to meet the subject of the very first Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and this has been Today in Running History. Berlin when in 1990 began, and later that night, the Exuke crowd began. Why don't I put more? I need to break things up into more paragraphs. This is really hard for me to read. Reading part. All right, third time's the charm. I've recorded this. This is my 3rd time starting over. I made too many mistakes.